Greetings, brothers and sisters. So I have this unbelievably lame statement on Afghanistan by Jojo Magoo that's full of comedy gold and just all of it, right? And CNN's coverage of it, Jim Acosta, and just, I mean, it's the worst. But let's start here. Fantastic new exhibit at Honolulu Museum of Art entitled Ukrainian Energy Expert. And so this is something to keep in mind, right? Because here's a guy who, well, let's go to this. So I covered this yesterday. So you can see that in purple is all the other countries in terms of their opium production, right? And this is Afghanistan. And you can see that, starts here, and Afghanistan opium production goes up. And then it was starting to go down here because of Taliban. And then it just skyrockets under the U.S., right? This is when the U.S. in 2001, opium production was really low. And then the U.S. invaded here in 2002, the end of 2001. And it skyrockets, the opium production. I mean, look at how much opium they were getting in the 2007, 2008. And here's the first wave of the opioid crisis started in the 90s. And then the second wave of 2010, that's when OxyContin came out, all those various types of prescription opioids and illegal heroin and things like this. This spike in opium production in Afghanistan is happening at the same time as the opioid crisis in America. You understand this. The Afghanistan war and the opioid crisis in America go hand in hand. So we need to keep this in mind as we understand the Afghanistan war, the Afghan war, which lasted since 2001. It started in 2001, right after that big event in October, and has continued on now for 20 years. So as I often say, I turn the news on a couple of times a day. I eat breakfast, lunch, sometimes at dinner. If I'm watching TV every once in a while, I just check out the news. And I can only watch it for minutes. It's just so bad. But almost every time I watch it, I find something worthy of a video to crap on the news, right? It's just so bad. And this is one of the worst segments I've ever seen. This guy, Jim Acosta, who is bringing new levels of ghoulishness to the news. I mean, he's so dead and low energy and like just life-sucking. And there's this one segment that, particularly stood out, but it's all really bad. And it's about the Afghanistan withdrawal and, Jojo Magoo, this guy.
How old are you, honey? You're 11 years old. Talk to me before we leave, okay?
You are live in the CNN newsroom. I'm Jim Acosta in Washington. We begin with breaking news. President Biden is announcing that...
Come on, Jim. Dial it down, buddy. Too much with the enthusiasm. Come on, Jim. Come on. Just relax a little bit, bro. Too much. You're over the top. You're doing the news here. Get a little more serious. I mean, it's just a little bit more somber, buddy. This too, a little more ghoulish. Just really embrace the ghoul. Relax. You're this energy and this enthusiasm and joy and happiness pouring off you.
He has authorized 5,000 troops to help ensure a safe and orderly drawdown in Afghanistan. This comes as the Taliban continues its brutal and unrelenting advance to take control of the country. Within the last few hours, Taliban forces claim they've captured 3 more major cities. That means they now control 22 of the country's 34 capitals. Only 2 major cities remain under the government's control. One of them is Afghanistan's capital of Kabul, but there appears to be no longer a question of if Kabul will fall, but when.
When is this morning? I mean, I don't know what time it is in Afghanistan, but this morning, all the news media were covering this. There was the front page of all the sites I went on. Here's Huffington Post. Taliban enters Kabul, stunning sweep across the country. They're just, rolling it out there. So this is from the New York Post. Every this is the big news this morning, right? Turn on the news. They're going to be talking about how the Taliban have entered Kabul and Afghanistan is now under Taliban control, and Americans are running out with their tail between their legs, right? And a total lack of accountability for this disaster of a war.
There's also an urgency this hour at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul as 3,000 new troops arrive to get Americans to safety and destroy sensitive materials. CNN's Arlette Saenz is at the White House for us. The president is at Camp David. And we have this statement from the president in just the last hour or so. Arlette, what more are you learning?
We're learning the president's a putz and you're a ghoul, Jim. The president is clueless and this is a complete failure and really a crime against humanity, this entire war and this entire Arab Spring that's been a disaster, and that no one's going to take accountability for it, and America's collapsing. Because that's what happens when you invade Afghanistan. It's like cursed. It's where empires go to fall. That's what we're learning, Jim. And by the way, take your pulse. I think you died 20 minutes ago.
Well, Jim, this is really the most robust statement we've gotten from President Biden since the security situation in Afghanistan has deteriorated. And the president explains how he has authorized the deployment of 5,000 American troops to Afghanistan to help draw down and evacuate American civilians and also help get those Afghans who had helped the U.S. over the course of this 20-year war. Now, just to clarify,
everything I'm about to tell you is complete bullshit, right? This is the part that I tuned into, and I couldn't believe one part of it. All of it's bad, but one part stands out.
The majority of those 5,000 troops were either already on their way or in Afghanistan, but there is an additional 1,000 troops who are now being sent that way. Now,
you always know that you won the war when you're removing your troops and you have to bring more troops in to remove your old troops, right? Otherwise you would be completely overrun. Like, you always know that that's a sure sign of victory.
in this statement, the president also issues a warning to the Taliban, saying that they have warned them that there will be consequences if Americans are put in danger. The president says that they've warned the Taliban through representatives, saying that any action on their part on the ground in Afghanistan that puts U.S. personnel or our mission at risk there will be met with a swift and strong U.S. military response.
Now, this is the big piece. This was like an OMG moment. The Taliban are just running over they're just conquering back Afghanistan. The whole reason we went in there in the first place, we as America, I don't know, not me, right? The whole reason America went in the first place was it was said that the Taliban were harboring, bin Laden and people like him, and it was a safe haven for those types of people. And so there had to be a response in 2001 after that event, and so they went into Afghanistan. They said bin Laden was there. No proof was ever, he was on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and no proof was offered that he was ever there. The guy was 6'5", wearing a white sheet, and he has really bad kidneys. He's old, and he needed to have kidney dialysis. He was a former asset who was armed and trained by the CIA, and he is from the bin Laden family, which has multiple dealings with America, business dealings, oil dealings. It is a billionaire family. And so all that looks very suspicious. And so Afghanistan, which has been the graveyard for empires, where empires go to fall, and now America is limping out of there, and I'll get into the situation, how bad it is, and how emboldened the Taliban are now after America has been there for 20 years. And we'll get into that as well, right? That's how Joe Biden said, 20 years. And so he's issuing a warning as we slink out of there with our tail between our legs, an epic failure. Hey, you guys knock it off over this. Like some guy who just got his ass kicked, and he's staggering out of the bar, going, "Hey, and don't ever try that again." Right? And so he's issuing a warning, like, yeah, we're not pussies. Hey, you guys try anything, guess what? We're gonna retaliate. We're gonna come back and reinvade here. We're gonna do this again. We'll do it all over again. You don't get no one. It's just a warning to make it sound like we're tough guys or he's a tough guy, right? The administration, because it's a complete failure. It's everything that America's about. We're a very warlike country, and we're a very competitive country, and we're number one and all that stuff, right? And winning wars is a big thing to Americans and America, and this was a complete epic disaster. She's like, well, he's warned. Warren, let's watch that part again.
In this statement, the president also issues a warning to the Taliban, saying that they have warned them that there will be consequences if Americans are put in danger. The president says that they've warned the Taliban through representatives, saying that any action on their part on the ground in Afghanistan that puts U.S. personnel or our mission at risk there will be met with a swift and strong U.S. military response. And you also have the president in this statement offering a defense of his decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan.
Get ready for this. Because there's no defense for this, right? It's a complete and utter failure.
In the coming weeks, the president specifically places blame on his predecessor, former President Trump, saying that he negotiated a deal with the Taliban that ultimately empowered the Taliban.
Trump's fault. It's Trump's fault. Wait, I didn't think that. I didn't see that. Where'd that come from? I never thought that would. It's Trump's fault. Totally Trump's fault. It's Trump's fault. Obviously, it's Trump's fault.
And promised that withdrawal. The president, in his statement, I want to read you what he said. He said, when I became president, I faced a choice: follow through on the deal with a brief extension to get our forces and our allies' forces out safely, or ramp up our presence and send more American troops to fight once again in another country's civil conflict. President Biden says, I was the fourth president to preside over an American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I would not and will not pass this war on to a fifth.
You see how greasy these MNFers are, right? Now, I'm not a Trumper, didn't vote for Trump, just in case you don't know. But Trump had nothing to do with the Afghanistan war. He wasn't a politician. He was on The Apprentice when the Afghanistan war began. I think The Celebrity Apprentice, perhaps, but one of them. Actually, The Apprentice didn't start till 2004, so he wasn't even on The Apprentice yet when this war started. The war started 3 years before Trump was even on The Apprentice. Trump didn't have any political aspirations as far as anybody knew. Nobody thought he was going to be president. And Joe Biden was a senator who voted for and was all about the Afghanistan war and the war in Iraq. He was pro-war. He is a warmonger. He's part of the military-industrial complex. He's a big war guy. Sent his kid over there. I mean, his kid went to Iraq, one of them, the one that's not Hunter Biden, the crackhead. Can't send a crackhead to war. Or can you? Send Hunter Biden over to Afghanistan. And so Joe Biden voted for the war. He's a part of the war. And then he was vice president under O'Biden. And O'Biden didn't, get rid of the war, didn't stop the war. In fact, O'Biden, with Hillary, started the Arab Spring, which involved 3 more countries that got into this conflict. They went into Libya, destroyed the Libyan government. Libya's a mess ever since. It's a nightmare there. Destroyed that country. And, they're living impoverished lives over there. Again, these illegal wars, and then tried to do it in Syria and, had regime change in Egypt, right? And so, Biden, they were pro-war. Biden was a big droner, right? And so now they're trying to blame Trump for this. And the reason is, which he didn't allude to, but I saw it when I ate breakfast. I started this video, then I went to eat breakfast. And I turned on the news, and CNN was in a commercial. I went to MSNBC because they're the ones I find the most comedy value out of. And there was a person saying, he watched Anderson Cooper, which is on CNN, another network, and this guy was on, and he said when Trump negotiated with the Taliban during his presidency, the Taliban said they didn't want the new government at the table, and Trump negotiated without the new government because the new government was a joke. Everyone knew they were going to fall, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And because of that, the government lost their will and just completely caved to the Taliban. And so it was his fault that this is going the way it is. I ask you not. Then they had a couple experts that backed this idea. This is on MSNBC. Again, Joe Biden was his guy's fingerprints all over this as a senator, as a vice president, and now as a president, right? This 20-year war, Joe Biden was in politics and was responsible for this, partially responsible for this over those 20 years.
The president making very clear that he remains resolute in that decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. And right now, so much of the priority is ensuring an orderly and safe drawdown of Americans who are currently in the country.
See that last piece. Watch as she ends this thing. She takes a breath and she makes this expression. Watch her expression here.
Is ensuring an orderly and safe drawdown of Americans who are currently in the country.
She's like, wow, I just got through all that bullshit, right? I got through all the... Whoa, that was a tough one, right?
Currently in the country. Currently in the country. Currently in the country.
And Arlette, what are we learning about how early they began planning for the removal of Americans there?
Well, the planning for this has been underway for months. Our colleague over at the Pentagon, Barbara Starr, reports that the Pentagon had been planning for possible evacuations in May. That was part of the overall plan.
Wow, all the way back in May? You guys were really planning. This was a plan of a plan of a plan. You guys just didn't do this overnight. You've been planning. All the way back in May, you've been planning. After 20 years, a plan that started in May. Good planning, planners.
To plan for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. She said, Barbara says that as recently as just 2 weeks ago, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was asking for updated tabletop exercises.
Tabletop exercises? Tabletop exercises? You mean like ping pong? Like what? Pool? Like what? Billiards, I mean? What are you talking about, tabletop exercises?
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was asking for updated tabletop exercises to prepare for the possible evacuation. And just to put a point on how seriously and how swiftly this administration wants to act, a U.S. defense official tells Barbara, time is of the essence. We don't have the luxury of time to wait.
Because if we do, the Taliban is going to come in and kick the shit out of us. So, you know, time, we don't have the luxury of time. We got to get out of there before we have another giant Omega hostage crisis. So we got to get out. We don't have time. We got to get out of there yesterday.
They certainly don't have that luxury. All right, Arlette Saenz, thank you so much for that report. And I want to bring in retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. He's a CNN military analyst and former official at the National Security Agency. Colonel, thanks so much for being with us.
So first of all, Colonel, let's draw your attention to this map over here. As you can see, red represents Taliban control, and also the black cities, they represent the cities that are under Taliban control. And so what are our prospects of getting out of this country safely? Because it looks like we're pretty screwed. What do you think about that, Colonel? And also a follow-up question, Colonel, where's America going to get our opium from now that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan?
As things are just rapidly deteriorating in Afghanistan, every few hours today we've learned about a new city captured by the Taliban. Are you surprised at the speed in which these major cities are falling? It's just incredible to watch.
It really is, Jim, but I'm not surprised. And the reason, Jim, I'm not surprised is because we have known for a very long time.
But not before Trump, right? We never knew before Trump, only after Trump, right? During Trump time we knew, right? Not anything, because we want to pin this thing on Trump, so nothing before 2016, right? Long time means sometime between now and 2016. It's got to go that way. That's the narrative we're trying to pitch here, buddy.
that the Afghan military has had a lot of serious problems, including not only morale, but also the ability to maintain the force. In other words, they don't have the ability to keep their people. There are a lot of desertions that have preceded even these drastic events right now. And it was very clear to me from the very beginning that once we started the withdrawal process, the Taliban would advance very rapidly. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
See, I've known this for years. America went into this war. We'll get into this part. I want to save this part because the price tag's coming up. So I want to drop this little bit. But part of this thing is that the Afghan troops wouldn't fight, right? They were trained and armed by America, but they weren't into it. Like when they would show up at the American troops would take would be the backbone of the battle, right? And oftentimes their soldiers would go and desert to the Taliban. Like everyone knew, I mean, this has been known for a long time, that the forces that America was training were going to collapse as soon as America left. That's why America stayed there. This has been known. I mean, this is, back in like 2005 or 6 or 7, whenever they, first started to do joint missions with these Afghan troops that were trained by Americans. Like everyone knows this. And at that point, the war was lost. Everyone knew as soon as we leave, America left, American military left, the Taliban were to take over. It was already known. That was the inevitable ending. Like they knew this a couple years after the initial invasion in 2001.
And I want to read more from President Biden's statement that just came out during this program, put up on screen. It says, over our country's 20 years at war in Afghanistan, America has sent its finest young men and women, invested nearly $1 trillion.
$1 trillion, right? Like, I'm coming back to that. This cost $1 trillion. Well, only $1 trillion? Okay, we got off the hook. Only $1 trillion this thing cost. 1,000 billion. A billion is 1,000 million, right? Think about this. 1,000 million is a billion, and 1,000 billion is a trillion, right? So it's like almost incomprehensible how much money that is. And that's what this thing cost, of a complete and epic failure. I'm coming back to this. We're going to bring this trillion up now for the rest of this video. This $1 trillion is going to be featured.
Finest young men and women, invested nearly $1 trillion, trained over 300,000 Afghan soldiers. And
so those trained Afghan soldiers, 300,000 of them, are now trained by America Taliban soldiers or dead. Like, take your pick. They're either dead or they are now part of the Taliban, and they've been trained by America. Going to come back to that because that's really important.
Afghan soldiers and police equipped them with state-of-the-art military equipment and maintained...
Equipped them. They equipped these 3,000 troops, right, with state-of-the-art equipment. This is his confession of a complete failure. Not just his failure, but all of them, all these career politicians. Equipped these troops with state-of-the-art military equipment that now is in the hands of the Taliban. $1 trillion.
Their Air Force, as part of the longest war in U.S. history, 1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country.
So remember 5 minutes ago when this colonel, who is considered an expert by CNN on this subject, right, said this?
It was very clear to me from the very beginning that once we started the withdrawal process, the Taliban would advance very rapidly, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
It was clear to me and this guy, right, and everybody else who knew anything about this at the very beginning. That's in 2001, 2002, probably 2002. That's the beginning. Invaded in 2001 in October, the end of 2001. And then 2002, 2003, this guy and everyone else realized the military being trained, Afghan military being trained by the U.S. was not going to stand up to the Taliban. And so then Joe Biden just says this.
1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country.
Okay, so it's been established, this colonel said, it was known within the military, he knew it, that the Afghan military was never going to stand up. And Jojo Magoo is finally admitting this so many years later, but him and Obama, like, look at what they did, right? So this is what President Obama in 2011, he had been president for 3 years at the time, said about Afghanistan.
By the time I took office, the war in Afghanistan had entered its 7th year. But al-Qaeda's leaders had escaped into Pakistan and were plotting new attacks, while the Taliban had regrouped and gone on the offensive. Without a new strategy and decisive action, our military commanders warned that we could face a resurgent al-Qaeda and a Taliban taking over large parts of Afghanistan. For this reason, in one of the most difficult decisions that I've made as president, I ordered an additional 30,000 American troops into Afghanistan. When I announced this surge...
Yeah, how'd that work out? I wonder how that's going to work out. Past President Obama, how's that working out, I don't know, in 2021, right?
At West Point, we set clear objectives to refocus on al-Qaeda, to reverse the Taliban's momentum, and train Afghan security forces to defend their own country.
It was already known. This colonel knew it. Everyone in the military knew it. The media knew it. Obama knew it. Biden knew it, right? Hillary knew it. All these people knew it, that it was over, that the trained Afghani troops were not going to stand up to the Taliban, and that this war was going to be an epic failure, and somebody was going to end up holding the hot potato on this one. And it's going to be Biden, right? It's going to be Magoo. You know, like right now we know it's Magoo. Back then, Obama was just putting more troops in there to avoid being blamed for what was going to be an epic failure. Here's Magoo in 2012.
Vice President Biden. Let's keep our eye on the ball. The reason I've been in and out of Afghanistan and Iraq 20 times. I've been up in the Konar Valley. I've been throughout that whole country, mostly in...
So someone might say you might be responsible for what happens there.
A helicopter and sometimes in a vehicle. The fact is, we went there for one reason, to get those people who killed Americans, al-Qaeda. We've decimated al-Qaeda Central. We have eliminated Osama...
So it's kind of a success story.
...bin Laden. That was our purpose. And in fact, in the meantime, what we said we would do, we would help train the Afghan military. It's their responsibility to take over their own security. That's...
How's that going to play out when you're president, I don't know, 9 years later?
Why with 49 of our allies in Afghanistan, we've agreed on a gradual drawdown, so we're out of there by the year 2014.
2014?
My friend and the governor say it's based on conditions, which means it depends. It does not depend for us. It is the responsibility of the Afghans to take care of their own security. We have trained over 315,000, mostly without incident. There have been more than 24 cases of green on blue where Americans have been killed. If we do not, if the measures the military has taken do not take hold, we will not go on joint patrols. We will not train in the field. We'll only train in the Army bases that exist there.
Magoo was a lot sharper back then, but he's still a lion MNFer because all these things, he's talking big talk, right? But we didn't get out of there in 2014, Jojo. And what he said there was 24 green on blue. Blue was the Afghan army trained by Americans, and they went on joint missions, and the Afghanis fired on Americans and killed them, right? American troops. They were supposed to be working together, right? So this is on, him and Obama, like those things were happening. He said, hey, if they don't stop shooting at us, we're not going to go on any more joint missions with them, right? We're going on joint missions with them, and they're shooting at us, and we're not having it. We're only going to train them at the base. We're not going to go out there in the field where they shoot at us. But let's send some more troops in.
But we are leaving. We are leaving in 2014, period. And in the
period. End of statement. I have spoken. I swear on my crackhead son.
Process, we're going to be saving over the next 10 years another $800 billion. We've been in this war for over a decade. The primary objective is almost completed. Now all we're doing is putting the Kabul government in a position to be able to maintain their...
A very clean welcome mat for the Taliban to come in 2021 when I'm president.
Their own security. It's their responsibility, not America's.
What?
Good boom. Look at this MNF. He means he's a tough guy. So just to make sure you know what we just saw there. First of all, we saw a colonel say that he knew from the beginning the Afghanistan military wasn't going to stand up to the Taliban. From the beginning. And the rest of us knew. I knew, and why would I know, right? I barely watched the news, but it was on the news. They were out there, and they were being trained, the Afghanistan army. They were deserting. They were turning on the Americans. They were going over to the Taliban, and they were hiding and not fighting when war broke out, when they went on joint missions, or even firing on Americans. And so then in 2011, Obama came out and said, we're sending in 30,000 more troops, even though he knew this. And Joe Biden, a year later in the debate, said, yeah, we're getting out of there. No questions asked in 2014, when they all knew that the Afghani military wasn't going to stand up. And now he's finally admitting this after being a part of this. He said he took 20 trips by 2014 to this region. He was, voted for it. He was vice president when they could have gotten out of there. And then now he's saying, well, what's another 5 years or another 1 year when we know the Afghanistan military is never going to stand up to the Taliban? We knew that in 2002, right? And this is on you, MNFer, not for what you're doing now, for lying for the last 18 to 19 years, right? And being a part of administration and a government and a military-industrial complex that kept this thing going.
Colonel, I suppose he has a point there, and the president is indicating, I think very clearly, he is not changing his mind on this. What do you think? Do you agree with the thoughts that he put forward there?
Yeah, I do actually, Jim, and the reason I do is because what the president is saying, why throw good money, in this case, good training?
Yeah, but he did that. Like you just said it, MNF, or you just said, like I just showed it twice, you said you knew from the beginning the Afghanistan troops weren't going to stand up. And so, after that, Obama and Biden came in and they campaigned and ending these wars that were started under Bush. And then they started their whole Arab Spring thing, which was also a disaster, right? Which is a failure. And, I've covered that in so many videos. But you just said that we all knew, that you knew, and everyone kind of knew it was there to be known that the Afghani military wasn't going to stand up to the Taliban. And so we've been throwing more, good money after bad, right, into this thing and training and all this stuff. And we've been supplying these, the military there with arms, with expensive weaponry that is now in the hands of the Taliban, who is being re-emboldened because they're better trained now, because so many of these guys are going to be in the Taliban that American trained. So they have American training and state-of-the-art American weapons. And a lot of that was done by Obama and Biden. Of course, Bush is equally responsible. But, so don't pat the president on the back for being, 19 years too late.
Yeah, I do actually, Jim, and the reason I do is because what the president is saying, why throw good money, in this case, good training after bad? And what you're looking at is, in essence, a drastic way to cut our losses. Now,
at $1 trillion, right? We're talking about $1 trillion.
The actual execution of this is another matter. And, in Arlette's report, we learned about the planning that had gone on from about May until the present time to do this. What bothers me about this are two things. First of all, that they didn't seem to account for the rapid advance of the Taliban.
Yeah, but this was going to happen no matter what, right? As soon as we left, which you just said, you knew since the very beginning, as soon as we left, not we, the American military left, the Taliban was going to take over. Everybody knew it. It was inevitable, right? The same thing happened in Vietnam. No president wants to admit to losing a war. No president wants to be on the hook for losing a war. And so, Trump campaigned on getting out of Afghanistan and was an anti-war president. He did a good job at not starting any more new wars, which was, to his credit. But he didn't get out of Afghanistan, and he tried, or he, put some feelers out there and chose not to because of what's happening right now.
And secondly, that a lot of the Afghan interpreters and others from Afghanistan who have served the U.S. military over the last 20 years, that their fates are being ignored by this. And it seems as if that was an afterthought. Now they're trying to catch up and trying to get these people out.
Well, they'll get some of them out, but not all of them.
But that is a very big issue that they're going to have to pay very close attention to.
Yeah, we absolutely cannot leave them high and dry. They helped the United States through all of this. The United States.
What are you talking about? We are the epitome, the definition of what we're doing is leaving all these Afghanis who were influenced by Americans and American life high and dry. The Taliban is so anti-West and so, the Taliban's like what nightmares are made of, right? They're very, religious in a fundamentalist, violent way. And all these people that supported the Americans for the past 20 years, and there's lots of them, are going to be tortured and killed. They're not, they are all those people that were like, hey, it's a new day here, and America's liberated us from the Taliban, and the women who took off their head coverings or whatever might have, happened there, women who were behaving in ways the Taliban were brutal. They got rid of their athletics, their athletic teams, and using the stadiums to torture people and do horrible things, right? And we know about the Taliban. This is what was said about the Taliban before we were there, before American military was there. And now there's too many Afghani people who were, who have been exposed and are now going to be targeted by the Taliban to get them out, right? You're leaving them high and dry. That's the definition of what we're doing here, what the American military is doing here. And this is why CNN sucks. Why would you even say that? We can't leave them high and dry. We just can't. We can't do it, right? We're not going to do it. What are you talking about?
Yeah, we absolutely cannot leave them high and dry. They helped the United States through all of this. The United States has to help them. And we've seen video of the Taliban at abandoned U.S. military bases driving American trucks as they take over cities. And it makes you wonder, what were the last 20 years for? We built up this country, as the president was saying, we built up this military. Are we just going to watch it go up in smoke in real time? Is that what we're going to do here?
Yes, that's exactly what we're doing. Why are you even asking that question? That's what's happening. That's what we're seeing. That's what's happening. That's what Magoo's statement said. That's what we're doing. We failed completely, and now we're leaving all of this equipment and all everything, all the training, all this stuff to the Taliban.
Well, and that's really the sad thing about this, Jim. All the blood and treasure that we've sacrificed, all the lives that we've sacrificed, that is a real problem when you look.
The American people lost, and America as a government lost in terms of American, as a military lost. But there are winners in this. There are winners. There are obvious losers, and I'll go through the losers. And then I'm going to go through the winners. Of course, the Taliban are winners, but that's not what I'm talking about. See, this is something where you probably won't get this from anybody else, or very few people, have the same point of view that I have, because I'm not a Republican person. I'm not a pro-war. I'm anti-war. Like, there's lots of so-called patriots who consider themselves truthers who are sort of pro-war. They were into this when it was happening. I knew from the very beginning this stuff was all BS, what Bush was doing when he launched these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I knew it even more when Obama and Biden, Hillary Clinton launched the war in Libya, right, and these other things that were happening. And I even know more now of who, wins these things, right? Who gains from these things, right? Because we're making the same mistakes over and over again. We go into these wars that are ultimately going to fail, and the people who launch these wars know they're going to fail, but they're doing it because they are going to benefit personally. And so let's go through that. Let's first talk about what was lost here. So I've seen the media and the military lie us into these wars ever since Afghanistan. I was, this is when I was becoming awake, and I saw them lie their way into these things. And so what they said was bin Laden was in Afghanistan, and it was a harbor, and this is what Obama said. Again, he repeated these lies in 2011, and it was a harbor for these types of groups, bin Laden type of groups, and that the Taliban were bad guys, and as long as they were running it, as long as they were in charge of Afghanistan, then America was going to be unsafe. So that's what we were told, especially after a national traumatic event happened that, Americans were fearful and angry and wanted payback. And this is where they directed that anger through lies and manipulation, because there was no evidence ever presented that bin Laden was even in Afghanistan. And the goal, which was to free Afghanistan from the Taliban so it wouldn't be a safe harbor for these groups, is a complete lie. We know that it's a failure. Now that's going to even be worse, because the way that Magoo is leaving, that American military is leaving, it's not only handing the country back to the Taliban, but now American military training, the greatest military in the past 5,000 years. I mean, there's no comparison with the best technology and state-of-the-art weapons. And we're talking about $1 trillion. I mean, some of these weapons, some of this money that was spent on these weapons and training is all in the hands of the Taliban. Now the Taliban is better trained, they're better armed, and they have more money behind them because of American money that was dumped into this country, infrastructure that was built, and things like this. The Taliban is much better off, and America will never go back there, and neither will anybody else, right? Because what wasn't said to the American people is that Afghanistan is where empires go to die, all the way back to Alexander the Great. I told this story in my video that's up on Apocalypse Now and my other channel, Apocalypse Now. And my brother and I were talking. My brother is, he's very affected by Vietnam. Vietnam comes up quite a bit when we talk. And he's watching this, and he has lots of time to watch the news and see what's happening. And it's exactly, for him, it's exactly like what happened in Vietnam. If you've ever seen the first Rambo movie, First Blood, which is a really good movie, funny and interesting, Sylvester Stallone as Rambo goes on this long sort of crying rant at the end of the movie saying they didn't let us win, right? And my brother said that's how he and so many other people, vets, he counseled vets, felt after Vietnam. They wouldn't allow the American troops to do what was necessary to win that war because the war was never about winning. And I'll come back to this because this was a mistake made in Vietnam, and Vietnam was never about what they said it was about. And there was winners in Vietnam like there's winners in the Afghanistan, because when you dump in this much money, $1 trillion, when you dump $1 trillion into something, some people are getting paid, right? And I'm going to go through who got paid because it's, imperative to understand this. But we look like we're losing because the objective that we went in there, just like with Iraq and all these other wars with Libya, the objective, the stated the stated objective to the American people was not achieved. In fact, the exact opposite has happened. The Taliban is greater armed. $1 trillion was spent, 20 years, all these lives of young people who were in the military was lost, and then all these people who embraced American culture in Afghanistan and supported the American effort are being left high and dry, despite what Jake Tapper Jr. was saying here, Acosta, right? What he was saying here. We can't leave them high and dry. We just can't do it. That's not cool. Let's not do that. It's already done. So to understand the winners here, who won, right? Who's pocketing money? Who's walking away? Who got paid? Who's walking away with money? Who got paid by this $1 trillion? Lots of people did. Lots of people. When you spend $1 trillion on something, 1,000 billion, right? It's a billion's 1,000 million. So you think about that. Just 1 billion. There's $1,000 million to pay to people, and people are organizations, corporations, and things. So who's going to walk away with some of that $1 trillion, right? And people did. To understand it, let's look at this video of Wesley Clark, a former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Clinton, right? A Democrat who ran it for president as a Democrat, and he had this big reveal on that show Democracy Now!
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said,
So to understand who the winners are, you have to understand how the American system works, right? America is our number one economic and, social. I mean, it's every part of our system is about the military and war. And so if you look at our entertainment, look at all the fighting, look at all the violence that is in our entertainment. There's fights on sitcoms, right? And you think about pretty much every movie or TV show has some sort of physical confrontation. Guns are often used. Violence is often used. And so that's just our entertainment culture. Football is basically war, a sport is about land acquisition, right? You're chewing up the yardage, right? The offense and the defense. And so, all sports are somewhat about war and, there's some conflict and competition, but football more than anything else. And then at the halftime or before the football game, there's so much patriotic war porn, basically. Recruitment for the military, thanking the military. People always thanking the troops. So just in our culture alone, there's all this warlike culture, our Star-Spangled Banner, all this stuff, right? This war song, war, 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 war. And we have this huge military-industrial complex, and it's our number one budgeted item. It makes up about 60% of the American budget. It usually is about $1.7, $1.6 trillion a year, And that's not counting the wars. That's just for military expenditures for the military-industrial complex and for paying and training the troops, right? All these facilities, war bases, and things like this. And so the IRS collects about between $3.1 and $3.4 trillion in tax revenue every year. And the military budget is, over half of that. And again, not including wars, not including the money, the trillions of dollars that, like $1 trillion in Afghanistan, the multi-trillions of dollars in Iraq. I mean, all these various places, all these recent wars cost, I think, around $4 trillion. I'm not sure the exact amount. But no matter what, our war is our number one thing as a country. And that might be shifting, but we're the number one military in the world. Like there's nothing close to us, there's never been anything in modern history close to the American military, which is a great source of pride to most Americans. And it is pitched out there time and time again in the American government, the American media, how great it is, how much our military is great. And I've said this so many times in other videos, that if an individual person spends 60% of their income on weapons year in, year out, and military training, whatever that, personal security, whatever it is, people would think that person's insane. If 60% of your budget's going to weapons, and you would be on some sort of monitor list by the FBI, your friends and family would be scared of you, and you'd be somebody who's off the wall. But when America does it in terms of the, our governmental budget, it's applauded. And, everything's about pro-war. So for this to work, for this kind of ideology to work, you need a threat, right? You need some sort of a threat. If there's nothing threatening you as a country, no other military force, when there's no one that wants to challenge America, and there's no one that's even thinking about invading America, then what's the reason for all this military? There's just no reason for it. And so they have to create threats in one way or another. There has to be the idea of a threat, a military threat, or something that would justify this expenditure on the American military and the American military-industrial complex, which is our biggest business. And so there has to be an export of weapons to other countries. That has to happen. We have to sell these weapons we're making to other countries or give them to them in some way to assure national security. That's got to be part of it. There has to be a threat. There always has to be some sort of threat. And ultimately, there has to be wars. Wars have to be waged so we can, continue this military-industrial complex. What ultimately happens to an empire is that people get soft and they don't, see any need for war, and they don't, have any, they don't really think that there needs to be much of a military, and they don't want to go fight themselves. And so their army falls apart. Their will to go out and fight wars and sacrifice and have the young people go out and fight the war and just all the money that's spent. And so they end up you see this with all these empires that have fallen. They run out of this idea of, they mature out of this idea of being militaristic. And this is something that they've worked hard for Americans not to do. One of the things, no matter how much debt we have, no matter how much, there's money issues with America, they never propose cutting back on the military budget. They never do. That's never on the table. Like substantially, like cut it in half. That would be like $800 billion. It would be a fortune. That's never on the table. America can never do that. And one of the reasons is that our dollar is backed by the military. I have one of these memes. I'll hopefully find it and put it somewhere in this video. But it says the U.S. dollar used to be backed by this, and it shows gold. Now it's backed by this, and it shows a bunch of naval ships. Eisenhower warned against, I'll see if I can find that clip. Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex, and Eisenhower was a former general, and he was still against the military-industrial complex.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So that's just a brief clip of President Eisenhower's farewell speech. And if you can see the vocabulary and his articulation and some of the things he says, I mean, it's just far superior to what we see, certainly now with Jojo Magoo, but also with Trump and all of the presidents in recent years. I mean, it's a much more substantial speech. And he warns against the military-industrial complex and its, attack on U.S. liberty. Because America, and again, I'm not a big founding fathers person. I mean, they all owned slaves and, I'm not, oh, yes, that was so great and they were so great, like our, so-called founding fathers. But the way the Constitution was written, that there wasn't supposed to be a standing military. There was supposed to be militias. Every, American male was supposed to own a gun and then go to war if necessary. So this idea of a standing military began, basically after World War II and the military-industrial complex. And he talks about technology. I mean, the whole speech is about 16 minutes, and it's well worth watching because lots of the things he warns against are happening. So the other piece to this, to be winners in the military-industrial complex, you're going to need wars, and you're going to need a second element, which is the rebuilding of countries, which I'll get into in just a moment. But what we saw with Wesley Clark, in Wesley Clark's speech, is that the Pentagon was putting together a plan to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And they got through some of them, right? They don't always meet their goals, right? They don't always, get everything that they want, everything on their Christmas list. But in this case, they got Afghanistan, they got Iraq, they got Libya, they got Egypt, and they started in Syria. And so they didn't get Lebanon, Somalia, and Sudan, right? Sudan. So that's 2 countries in Africa and 1 neighboring Israel. But they had those on the table. So it was really 8 countries, including Afghanistan. And if you understand, when you have a military-industrial complex, you have these generals that are around for 20 years. And we've now had our longest war, which is 20 years, more than 20 years. You have generals who are around as long as Biden is, like Jojo Magoo. Like, this is where Jojo Magoo, being a politician, a power figure in the political world for 47, 48 years now, is important to understand, because you have that with generals as well. But as Jojo Magoo said, this war went through 4 presidents. Bush started the war in 2001. Obama presided over it from 2004 to 2016. Trump took over for 4 years, and now Jojo Magoo. And so you have these lifers that work in the military-industrial complex and work in the CIA and in the intelligence community, and they don't want some president coming in. This is why Trump, they got rid of Trump. They were really against Trump because he wanted to get rid of a lot of these long-standing plans, not only of the military, but of the spy services. And so, he wanted to be president, and that's not what you're president of. Because when you come into office as a president, the military-industrial complex, your Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the CIA come in and say, these are existing operations and you can't F with them, right? You can't screw with them. You can't mess these things up. You can't come in and say, yeah, we're not doing this, and just wipe them out, because they've been working on these things for 40 years, 50 years in some cases, right? So that's how you have to understand the way these things go down. That this, whatever the events, and I don't believe any of this stuff. Like, I don't believe any of the reasons. I don't believe any of the catalysts for these wars. These wars we're always lied into these wars, right? And we now see the same mistake that was made in Vietnam, because the enemies of America, these countries that get invaded by America, these powerful forces, the North Vietnamese and the Taliban, know that they can't beat the Americans in a slugfest, going toe-to-toe and fighting a traditional war. So what they do is have guerrilla war. They fade into the background like they did in Iraq, like they did in Vietnam, the enemies, and they just outlast the Americans. They just survive, and they wait till America pulls out their troops, and they immediately seize control over the country. In this case, in Afghanistan, they seized control of American forces and American training, American weaponry, American trucks, because when you mobilize a military, when you have to ship military equipment over to countries that, in the desert with the sand and the conditions and the heat, a lot of these, these Humvees, the Hummers and the trucks that now have 100,000 miles on them or whatever it is, and they've taken on, explosions and IUDs and all these things, whatever's going on there, aren't worth shipping back, right? They have to, take most of this military equipment and put it in our, naval vessels and ship it over. Some of it comes in cargo planes. It costs a fortune in fuel to mobilize an army. That's why, Joe Biden making this lame threat at the Taliban as we, as we're running out of the country, right? With their tail between our legs, or the, his tail between his legs, whatever it is a joke, because we're never going back there, right? I mean, America isn't going to be the same anyway, but if America keeps its power, again, this is where empires go to die, and that should have been a piece of this, right? This should have been a message to the American people that this country seems to be cursed, right? And that if we go in there, it's likely that America will end up like these other empires that fell by invading Afghanistan. There's, some kind of spiritual energy there that makes this happen. And so these, leaders, these presidents come into a situation with the CIA and the military-industrial complex, and they're expected to carry on these plans. Trump didn't want to do it, and that's one of the reasons they did him the way that they did him, right? Again, I'm not a Trump fan, but I'm just pointing this out. So this new strategy, the guerrilla warfare tactics that we've seen in Vietnam and now in Iraq as well, and certainly in Afghanistan, shows you how you beat America. You just don't, you just survive it. You just outlast the American invasion, and then America loses because at least it loses on paper, and the American people lose, and the people that lose their lives and their families lose, but the American military-industrial complex doesn't lose. And so their stated goals for why they went into Afghanistan and Iraq have not been accomplished, right? The mission hasn't been accomplished. That stupid BS thing they did with bin Laden, with SEAL Team 6, I've covered that in other videos. That's all BS, right? And none of those things are true. But the winners, the military-industrial complex and the CIA and the intelligence community, which got away with these massive crimes, the drug industry. And so here are some of the winners and how they won. Well, the military-industrial complex, they not only got their usual $1.7 million budget, but then they had the wartime monies of trillions of dollars in the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. They got to, the American military used up a bunch of their equipment, so now they have to purchase new equipment. They got to test out their drones and all these things. And so the military-industrial complex walked away with a fortune. All these trillions of dollars, $1 trillion that was spent in Afghanistan, a lot of that went into the military-industrial complex. And also a part of the military-industrial complex is the rebuilding of these countries, of infrastructure. This is Halliburton. This is Dick Cheney, who is, made $80 million off of his Halliburton stock. He was in charge of this rebuilding, this military-industrial complex rebuilding company. And then he became vice president. He pushed through these wars, and him and his people who were, Halliburton, which made a fortune on, all these wars, rebuilding these countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, they win, right? All these types of, establishment criminals that, get America into these wars on lies and deception, and then they take a fortune out of these, expensive wars. So they're winners, right? They won this. They're some of the people that won this thing. Another scam. So, I just watched this documentary on HBO, The Crime of the Century, which was about the opiate epidemic. And that's, it's a good thing to watch, and it's kind of true. But these wars are the real crime of the century. Because, also who won was these drug companies, these pharmaceutical companies, and, opium dealers, heroin dealers, illegal street heroin dealers, all of which got a windfall profit from all the opium that was produced in Afghanistan. And we know about what happened with the opioid crisis, and then all these, people who died. It's $1 billion industry, and they won big, right? Because there's all this opium. I saw this in the American Gangster movie. My brother told me, when he was in Vietnam, that he guarded the poppy fields, and there was a CIA presence, right? Like they knew when there was CIA over there, you could, you just knew, and they were there guarding the opium fields. And in this American Gangster movie, which was based in a true story, they were shipping out the heroin in these coffins of dead soldiers, and they didn't have to, worry about these, this heroin getting seized. This is Vietnam heroin getting seized by the government, right? They didn't have to go through customs. They didn't have to smuggle it over the border. So it was pure heroin coming in and delivered by the military industrial complex to these drug dealers, and the CIA, being a part of that. We know from this guy, Gary Webb, there's a good movie about this. Gary Webb was a reporter that drew the link between CIA and drug smuggling. There's another movie called American Made with Tom Cruise, is a good movie, about this guy, Barry Seal, who smuggled in drugs from South America for the CIA. And so we also saw these pictures of troops, American troops, guarding the poppy fields in Afghanistan. These are all things that have happened, that are factual. And we know that the CIA, that has to run big budget covert operations, they don't want the Senate, they don't want the legislative branch to be in charge and have oversight over these missions, which are often illegal and seedy. And so they have to finance these missions themselves. They don't want to go to the American government. They don't want to go to Congress and say, we need you to fund this mission and be a part of it. They want to do it in secret. And so they have to fund it themselves. And the best way to make a quick buck, and lots of it, right, is through drug dealing. And that's what the CIA has engaged in, which is more or less admitted to. And so Afghanistan, some of the winners are the pharmaceutical companies, but also illegal drug dealers, and then also the intelligence community that also benefited from all of their technology being, tested and things. And, with the military-industrial complex and all this stuff that they're doing, they not only got, a boost in their technological development, but they also gained a lot of power, right? They had a lot of power in these wars, the military-industrial complex and the CIA. And there's personal winners, politicians that got paid off, whoever it might be, people like Dick Cheney, all these people that went into work in the private sector who voted for these wars and got campaign contributions, the media, their coverage of these things, the ratings that they get, the information and stories they get from the CIA and the government, the military-industrial complex, and the, power grab that we have here in America that's come from all this, right? Where there's, more and more restrictions, more and more of a military-based country that is, under some form of martial law, where people's civil liberties are being eroded by this power grab, right? And the passivity of the American people that have let this happen, the dumbing down of the American people, that's all part of it, right? So there are winners. We see that there are winners, right? And no one is being consequenced. No one's taking responsibility. Biden's trying to blame Trump on this thing. He was a part of this for years, knowing about this, doubling down with Obama, sending an additional 30,000 troops to something that everyone knew it was going to fail. And we see it, right? It's the same thing that happened in Vietnam, where ultimately this military force that is the Taliban, that used to be the Viet Cong, is reassuming control over the country, and Americans are fleeing out of there after spending $1 trillion and all the rest of it, like lives and just all of it, on something that they know is going to fail, at least fail in the so-called noble reason for going to war. Oh, there's people we're going to save, like they said about Gaddafi. But the people in Libya are so much worse without him. Gaddafi was actually a good leader. I've covered that so much. I mean, they come out with these various lies because if they told you the truth, you'd say, oh, that's evil. We can't do that. That's completely evil. They can't tell you the real reason they're going to war. They never can. I mean, that's just, it's not possible. And so they're always going to fail at their original objective because it's not their true objective. The war itself is their true objective. And they wreck these countries and often colonize them, export oil or opium or whatever it might be. I mean, there's other ways that profit is made. But the country itself is destroyed. The people who live there, I mean, the people that live in these countries, we've committed a crime on them as a country, as a political leaders and things like this, the decisions that are made. They have access to information. They know what's going to happen. We've seen it happen over and over again. And they're just repeating the same mistakes because they never are held accountable. Nobody goes to jail and nobody calls them on their lies. There's no longer a media that will give them any pushback. No one called Bush and Cheney on their lies, right? Everyone, who was halfway awake that wasn't a Republican could see, even people who were true sort of awake Republicans could see that we were being lied into these wars, a bunch of BS reasons that weren't, true on at any level to go to these wars. And now we see the outcome. And these same mistakes are being made over and over again. People do very poorly with power. I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about the Heartfulness meditation is a system without any power or force, because love is considered the forceless force, which is, the transmission that's given. That power is only given for divine purposes. If you're given a gift and a talent, it's for, the service of other people, and ultimately it's the service of God, right? Not for yourself, not to profit for yourself, not to, hold and wield power over other people and suppress them and use it, to somehow subjugate other people, or even, in the sense of the natural world, the animal kingdom, treating everything with respect and love and, bowing before God and humbling yourself. And that's the exact opposite of what was done here, right? This is, This is about power, and in the most demonic of ways, right? In a debt-based economy where, money is just printed or created on a digital level without anything to back it to pay for all of this, and leaving the, American children and the children of the globe in this soul-crushing debt that's now starting to emerge from the, the abyss of depravity. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Paul Romano, definitely reporting from the Apocalypse and the Ascension. Everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.